Hello, Nocturnist listeners. It's Emily. In case you missed last week's episode, we are back. We're picking up where we left off with Season 3 of our podcast last spring. Just so you know, these stories and conversations were recorded back in 2019, before the events of 2020 upended our lives. So listen with that context in mind. Here's the show.
At the Nocturnists, we are careful to ensure that all stories comply with healthcare privacy laws. Details may have been changed to ensure patient confidentiality. All views expressed are those of the person speaking and not their employer.
Life as a doctor is busy, so fitting children into the equation is really hard, especially for women whose physical bodies are affected by pregnancy and childbirth. This is The Nocturnists, stories from the world of medicine. I'm Emily Silverman. In this episode, we talk to family medicine doctor Miriam Sheinbein, who had her entire reproductive future mapped out until life started throwing her curveballs.
And for reasonings I cannot recall, I asked a colleague to pull my IUD.
Here's Miriam.
I was finishing up my medical school family planning elective when my eldest son, Kruv, was born. Without skipping a beat, I graduated medical school on time and flew across the country to start residency in family medicine at San Francisco General, breastfeeding a 6-month-old. About a year and a half later, I was pregnant a second time. On our 6th wedding anniversary, my husband Yaron and I scheduled our second trimester anatomy scan for a post-call afternoon. We were excited to find out the sex of the baby and then to celebrate the news over dinner. As a family medicine resident, I could easily see it was a boy. What I did not foresee was that our 20-week pregnancy would be diagnosed with a severe heart defect incompatible with life. We were shocked. And the choice for us was unambiguous. We had a healthy 2-year-old boy at home. I did not expect to cry, sorry. Thank you. Our daily reassurance that we could have another healthy child. So that night, I called a trusted medical attending who called abortion provider colleagues who figured out where I could be seen the soonest. And the next afternoon, a teacher of mine placed laminaria to dilate my cervix, and the following afternoon, another teacher performed my abortion. And without skipping a beat, I flew to Phoenix to take step 3 of my U.S. medical licensing exams. Over 2 days, I held my diarrhea for the test breaks, and I pressed my arms tightly against my engorged breasts, not expecting that after a 20-week termination, my milk would come in. Then life as a resident and a young mother went on as usual. We did not take long to try to get pregnant a third time, and my daughter Ramon was born my last year of residency. When Ramon was 9 months old, on the eve of Yom Kippur, the Jewish fast day of atonement, Yaron and I climbed into bed. Reflecting on our year, Yaron asked me how I was feeling. I broke down crying, realizing just how unhappy I was, trying to balance career with 2 little ones at home, underslept and overworked, not knowing how to find time for whom or for what, feeling insufficient in all parts of my life. I always thought that I wanted 2 boys and 2 girls. But for me, going from 1 to 2 felt significantly more than double. So when it came time to try for another, I was no longer so sure. Finally, out of training and in my dream job practicing family medicine at Planned Parenthood, I felt whole again with a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old at home. And my youngest one just started sleeping through the night. Did I want to risk giving up that wholeness for another child? And separate from that child, did I want to risk another pregnancy or birth? I was still traumatized by my first birth experience, a highly medicalized labor and a difficult C-section, followed by a failed trial of labor for my second birth. I felt like I was headed straight for a placenta accreta or some other dreaded medical complication. Nonetheless, and for reasonings I cannot recall, I asked a colleague to pull my IUD. A few months later at a medical conference, I told a friend and fellow family doctor that I was hesitating to get pregnant again, and I broke down in tears. I realized just how terrified I was that if something were to go wrong with me or with the pregnancy, that I wasn't sure that I could forgive Yaron, and I might hold it against him. So I called Yaron to tell him that I needed to go to therapy before we tried for another. As it turns out, I was already pregnant. I was devastated. We told no one. Feeling pressured for time, we rushed to a marital counselor, but we made no progress. Despite our imagined family of 4, for me, after 2, I felt like I was done. But for Yaron, weren't we still going for 4? Yaron's identity as a father and his notion of a family was a dinner table filled with cross-conversation, forks clanging, and the quieter ones trying to get a word in. We weren't there yet. I, on the other hand, had muscled my way through the end of medical school and my family residency, all while birthing and breastfeeding and lactating and birthing, and I was enjoying the relative calm. Ultimately, yet reluctantly, Yaron left the decision to me. And as the weeks went on, my indecision meant that I stayed pregnant and I remained heartbroken. I didn't tell anyone that I was pregnant because I was afraid they would say, "Congratulations." As my pregnancy roared into the second trimester, I went to see a therapist and I told her my story. "Miriam," she said, "it's okay to feel ambivalent." It was the exact medicine that I needed in that moment. She gave me the permission to feel what I was feeling, to be ambivalent. She normalized ambivalence in motherhood. For the duration of my 4th and final pregnancy, I held my ambivalence close as a reminder that my feelings were normal, including my fears and anxieties about birthing and parenting. In the end, my baby girl was born via family-centered C-section on what would have been my beloved Bubby's 100th birthday. At uterine incision, they pulled the drape down so I could see her born. They allowed my uterus to clamp down around her, and she let out a loud scream. And after delayed cord clamping, they put her on me skin to skin. And right there, still on the operating table, they placed my 3rd Mirena IUD. Unlike my older 2, who were born looking like me, Lefet was born with a dark head of hair, just like my husband. We like to say that due to my ambivalence in utero, Yaron's genes finally won out. But he forgot about round 2. As soon as Lefet latched onto me and I to her, all of her dark hair fell out and dirty blonde hair grew in. Yaron and I like to say that Lefet was our sweet compromise. I have come to understand that choosing to continue a pregnancy or to end it are part of the same story. With my first 3 pregnancies, the choices were black and white for me. Yaron and I were ready to have children, and I got pregnant. Our second pregnancy had a severe congenital defect, and we chose abortion. And by choice, I got pregnant again. When I grappled with ambivalence, I felt inextricably connected to centuries of women before and after me grappling with ambivalence. While our society may look unkindly upon a woman's mixed feelings about pregnancy and motherhood, it is exactly in these gray and murky areas where every woman deserves the right to wrestle, the right to choose, and in spaces like these to tell our stories. I am telling you mine so that one day you might tell yours too. Thank you.
So I am sitting here with Miriam Sheinbein. Miriam, thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
I'm so glad that we're able to bring your story onto the show and that we're able to meet for the first time. So can you tell me a little bit about your path to family medicine?
Sure. So as I shared in the story, I was very interested in the topic of abortion from a young age. My mother had a friend who was a lobbyist for Planned Parenthood, and she would come over for dinner and tell me stories, and I was truly inspired, and I think this was in 6th grade. And then the following year, actually, my father was diagnosed with colon cancer, and the most obvious symptom that he developed was due to the brain metastases. And I, at that point, decided I wanted to be a doctor and I was going to become a brain surgeon to figure out, I would solve, the ailments from which he had suffered. And I, applied to college knowing that eventually I would want to become a doctor, but I really wanted to focus on my liberal arts education, so I deferred all my sciences till the end. But I took a class at the end of college it was an introduction to gender and sexuality, and I was like, okay, I'm going to go into medicine, and these are the issues that I'm going to discuss. And then I was introduced to family medicine, where I realized that it would just be a part of my core training to be able to provide whole person care, and as part of whole person care, to be able to provide reproductive care, and as part of that, abortion care.
So as we're talking about family structure and that intersecting with health, I want to bring us into your story a little bit because it was such a gripping story and I was just like crying as I listened to it, especially because, full disclosure, I'm not a parent. I hope to be a parent someday, and I'm really kind of grappling with some of these questions of ambivalence, fear of the physical sacrifice, and so I'd like to get to all of that in a bit. But first, one of the moments that I loved most in your story is where you have, I think at this point, 1 child or maybe 2, and you're juggling everything as a doctor, and your husband, Yaron, approaches you and he says, "How are you feeling?" And then you just kind of break down. And so I was wondering if you could bring us a little bit into that feeling, like what was going on there for you?
I had finished residency 3 months prior. I had started a fellowship. I was exploring a research project. I was straddling 3 departments. I was practicing in my own continuity clinic and teaching residents, and then starting school to obtain a master's in epidemiology. And I had a 9-month-old at home, as I describe in the story, who didn't like taking the bottle and therefore breastfed all night. And I was exhausted. So when he asked the question, the exhaustion was at the forefront, and I collapsed.
Do you think he had any idea that you were feeling so exhausted?
Yes. Certainly. We often spend our Yom Kippur reflecting on the year before and then thinking about the year forward. And I think he was asking the question to make sure that I was giving myself the space to reflect and to ensure that I was making purposeful choices.
One of the lines that really stood out to me was, going from 1 child to 2 felt significantly more than double. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
I am not alone as a mother, particularly a working mother, and feeling that having a second child changes the dynamic and changes the work-life balance. There are very clear studies, particularly, I think, women in white-collar work who, when they have their second child, quit working despite the education and the time that they had put into their careers and the expectation that they would have a robust career. But certainly when you're in it, you feel very alone. So as I described, Yaron and I both come from families of 4 and very happy families of 4. And we are so lucky to have the relationships that each of us have with our siblings and with our now abundant nieces and nephews. And we wanted that for our children. And that was probably what attracted us to each other, early. We were dating from college and got married soon after. So we've really grown up together. And that was a shared connection. And certainly when we had one, the scope changes, so we'll take one at a time. But for me, certainly when we had the second, I couldn't even imagine that we would have another. But, as I described, Yaron was like, wait a second, we're supposed to be going for 4.
What is it about having a second kid that makes it feel like more than double?
I think generally with 1, you can pass 1 back and forth and still have independent time as you, as your own person. But when you have 2, it either means that each of you have 1 or that one of you is outnumbered, right? So I think that's, to me, some of the dynamic. Certainly, with people who have 1, there's a transition to having 1. I would say for Yaron and me, that was not a big transition. It was very smooth. We were young students, energetic. It felt just very fun. But 2 is real. You are in it. And I think the other piece, which I have to admit, and this brings it back to the doctor part of the story, is that I had a baby in medical school and in residency, and my husband Yaron was the primary caretaker for our baby. And when Ramon was born, my second, I was toward the end of residency and transitioning out of residency. So sometimes I wonder if some of the difficulty for me is this feeling of actually going from 0 to 2. So when we were considering having a third, and something that helped me is I asked a few parents who had 3 what it was like for them. And they would describe to me, the first was the excitement and chaos of having a baby. The second is that balance and how you manage that. And consistently, when they talk about the third, they would say, and the third is just a joy. And I obviously did not feel that way in the moment before she was born, but there is no question that with our third, she brought balance back into our life. And I am so grateful for that. And some of it, I think, is just because you're thrown over, the balance is totally tilted, that I think I had to also give up, right? So I think when when it was just two, if Yaron were away and it was just me, like, I was just nervous the whole time, and I certainly would not want to have any other children around. Like, I was managing my two and felt all the tension there. With three, like, you let go, and I'm like, more kids, like, just bring them over, like, no problem. So it's just a totally different dynamic. It's amazing.
I love that. I love that description of adding more brought balance. Like, it's just not very intuitive, and thank you for sharing that. I did want to talk a little bit about what you were saying earlier around your background and Yaron's background, both coming from happy, boisterous families of four. So my husband also comes from a happy, boisterous family of four. He's the second of four. And his instinct was to want for us what he had. I am an only child. I was adopted. So my mother was never pregnant, and I'm not biologically linked to my parents. And my parents, for whatever reason, just haven't really been pushing me to have kids, haven't really been like asking too much about, when are we gonna have grandkids? Like, they adopted me when they were in their early 40s. And so with me, they say, wait till you're ready and things like that. And so the reaction is just not the same as my husband's mother, who's like, so into it and like ready to retire immediately and like move in and like help and all of that. So what do you think it's about, this need to like recapitulate our own childhood, like that we just have to let history repeat itself? Or what do you think that's about?
My mind is sort of spinning on what you describe. We were describing earlier personality types. So part of the description of my personality type is that I have a very hard time deviating from a structured path, or if there was a plan and the plan changes, I have a very hard time sort of redirecting, unless there needs to be a new plan set up very quickly. And I think similarly for me, I always not only wanted 4 children, but I came from 2 boys and 2 girls, and Yaron's family is not in that order, but also has 2 boys and 2 girls. So not only did I want 4 children, but I wanted 2 boys and 2 girls. And I'm someone like, I have a strong belief, like, if you will it, you can do it. As you heard from my story, I breastfed through my intern year at San Francisco General, and I just sort of ignored the external voices. Like, it was something I was going to do, and I was just going to make it work and didn't think so much about it. And you hear in my story that I've been pregnant 4 times with 2 males and 2 females. And so imagine for me, like, deviating from that set path. So I would say for me, that was I had a positive childhood experience. It worked well. It was a great model. Let's try it now. And I don't know if that would be the case if I didn't, have positive foundational experiences.
One of the parts of the story that really stood out to me was how you were kind of looking back at all of the hours that you spent breastfeeding and pumping and just the physical toll of this. And I don't know, for me, it's one of the things I'm most afraid of when it comes to getting pregnant, just having gone through residency and having gone through that sleep deprivation and having no control over my own body, and when it was asleep and when it was awake and when it was working and when it wasn't, and not having time to like cook myself nutritious food or exercise. Like, I just feel like I've regained control of my body and agency over my body. And the idea of sacrificing it or putting it in danger, putting it in jeopardy, surrendering and losing control of my body again is just really scary. And so as you contemplated getting pregnant again, were there any fears that came up based on your medical knowledge and your experience as a family doctor or your experience having been pregnant once before?
One of the pieces of the story that still brings up a lot of anger in me is the consent for my first C-section. And in this consent, they talked about the immediate risks of having a C-section. But there was no mention for a woman who knew that this was not going to be my only pregnancy and was hoping to have 4 of what the risks are of a C-section. And that isn't a requirement in the way that we consent women to the surgical procedure seems to me egregious. And I still really, that piece of it really still affects me.
For our audience members / me who may not know what you're talking about, so short-term risks, you're talking about bleeding, talking about infection, things that are going to happen in days, weeks, but you're talking about long-term risks of C-sections. So can you share with us what are some of those long-term risks?
Yes. So there are multiple risks. One is certainly that if you become pregnant again, that the pregnancy could actually implant into the scar tissue, which is dangerous. Both it can constrict the growth of the pregnancy, but then also there's a risk of rupture of the uterus, and that can lead to hemorrhage and death later, closer to labor. There's also concerns about the placenta implanting into the scar tissue, and then the degree to which the placenta then implants into layers of the uterus, and the deeper that it implants, the more dangerous it is for risking hysterectomy and, again, complications of hemorrhage and death. So, as I mentioned in my story, I talk about a placenta accreta. That's like the worst kind. So I remember the relief in each of my pregnancies when they told me that my placenta was posterior, because the anterior, my scar is anterior in my belly. So I wanted to ensure that the placenta wasn't ever on the anterior surface and concerned about being in that scar tissue. It's also the pulse of what you know and don't know, right? That sometimes, unfortunately, what you do know makes things more complicated, and the anxiety more grave.
So between you and your own, you were the parent who had to deal with the physical aspects of the pregnancy because of the female reproductive equipment. So I'm just wondering, how did those discussions play out in your conversations with each other?
I think some of the tension was that because of my medical knowledge, I had anxieties about getting pregnant again and childbirth that Yaron and I could not, that he could not fully understand in the sense, because I think it was a combination, I don't want to say I was the irrational, anxious woman, but in some ways I think that may have a little bit been seen as it was perceived, even though in my mind it was grounded in understanding the risks of really the medical risks associated with me actually having another pregnancy and labor.
Yes, one thing that I wonder as I contemplate the idea of getting pregnant myself is, it isn't a process that is without risk, and yet a lot of the times it goes fine. And so on these days where I'm like, oh my God, hemorrhage, death, all these things, I'm like, am I just delusional? Am I just completely blowing this out of proportion? Or am I appropriately concerned that putting your body through this is really, probably one of the most medically risky things that you could do to a young, healthy body? But then on the other hand, it's most of my friends they're all having kids now and they're all fine. And so I don't know, what advice would you have for a young person like me who's afraid of the medical and physical aspects as somebody who has seen a lot of the complications, but also a lot of the normal, healthy, uncomplicated births. Like, how do you recommend that young women put this into perspective?
Sure. So I would say as a family doctor, this is, I think, where that perspective is really important. Most births are normal, right? And it is a problem when I think, unfortunately, in the medical setting, when we've seen so many of the complications, we look at what would otherwise be a normal appearing birth and see complications in it, right? And are worried that it's going to be a complication. And therefore, I think there's a concern about medical intervention unnecessarily in those settings. So I try to put on my family doctor cap to say that complications are unbelievably rare, and that pregnancy, and also, this is a personal, putting back on my personal cap, pregnancy was one of the most empowering experiences of my life. I have never felt so grand and beautiful and powerful as a woman.
Well, I've learned a lot from this. I will definitely take pieces of this conversation home with me because, as I mentioned, these issues have been very much at the forefront of my mind lately. And so I just want to say thank you for sharing this really vulnerable and intimate story with us. I just had so much fun talking with you.
Me too. Thank you.
That's our show. Join us next week, where I'll be talking to physician David Muller about his story, The Bridge. Next week is Giving Tuesday. What better way to support the healthcare community and storytelling than by making a donation to the Nocturnists? We have an exciting new project coming up in 2021, and we're relying on the support of our listeners to make it all happen. Make a gift at thenocturnist.com/donate. I want to thank executive producer Allie Block, producer and head of story development Adelaide Papazolo, podcast producer Liza Veal, director of operations Rebecca Groves, and communications specialist Cora Becker. Our original artwork is by Lindsay Mound. Our original theme was composed by Yosef Monroe, and additional music is from Blue Dot Sessions. The Nocturnist is made possible by the California Medical Association, the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, and people like you who have donated through our website and Patreon page. Thank you for supporting our work in storytelling. If you'd like to add your voice to one of our future projects, visit our website at thenocturnist.com. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review our show. To hear more true personal stories from healthcare professionals and research scientists, check out Saturday Night Stories from UC San Francisco. Each episode brings you deeply personal stories of the curiosity, inspiration, and sacrifice it takes to solve the most difficult problems in health today. Find Saturday Night Stories from UCSF on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. We are the Nocturnists. We'll be back next week.